Hey guys, it's Mario here, and today I have a very special guest that I want to introduce you guys to. His name is Stephan Guyenet. He's the author of the book The Hungry Brain, one of the books that I've read recently, and I'm a big fan of Stephan's work in general. And the reason why I wanted to bring him on to the channel is to discuss the concept of overeating and the neuroscience behind overeating and basically explain why it happens, how can we regulate that, and a lot of people that are, let's say, interested in weight loss, you will greatly benefit from knowing how your brain works and how to get the brain on your side. Stephan holds a PhD in neuroscience. He from a University of Washington. Is that correct, Stephan?
Yep, sure is.
And can you give a little bit of context for the viewers and listeners who haven't heard about your work? What is the main focus of your book, The Hungry Brain, and also your research in general?
Yeah, so my research at the University of Washington had to do with how the brain regulates body fatness, and particularly a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. A lot of people don't know this, but the brain regulates a lot of different variables in the body, such as breathing rate and heart rate and blood pH and things like that, and tries to keep them at a stable level. And one of the things the brain regulates in the body is the amount of fat you carry. And so that happens in this part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and changes occur in how that system operates that associate with obesity. So we know that obesity is not really, people who have obesity are different physiologically in how they regulate body fatness than people who are lean. And we can get into that a little bit more. But my research was on how that process occurs and how someone's brain, how the way that their brain regulates appetite and body fatness the goes from lean to obese. And so during the course of this research, I realized that a lot of people don't understand the critical role that the brain plays in regulation of food intake and body fatness, and that this is a very, very important concept because not only is it a way of understanding the problem that a lot of people aren't familiar with, but it relates to a problem that's very, very impactful. This is a very, very important problem, the problem of excess weight in modern affluent societies. And so after my postdoc ended at the University of Washington, I decided to write a book. And the premise of the book is that no one wants to overeat, yet we overeat anyway. And so, what is the disconnect there that drives our behavior to undermine our best intentions? So, obviously, eating as a behavior, and all behaviors are generated by the brain. So, eating is the result of brain activity. So, what are those brain activities that cause us to eat too much or cause us to eat unhealthy food and cause us to gain weight and undermine our health, even though those are not things that we actually want to do? And
Mhm.
so that's just a general introduction to my research background and what drove me to write the book.
Awesome. And we're going to cover some of that in depth in the interview. And just for the viewers and the listeners, the main topic that we're going to cover here is why do we overeat and also what can we do about it? And if it was all up to conscious effort when it comes to losing weight, I mean, there would be much more success when it comes to that. But before we dive into any in-depth look at what the brain does and how that is happening on a neurobiology level, let's create a bit of a context and put out some definitions for our viewers and our listeners. And we know that looking at last few decades, I mean, there's been a variety of attempts to explain the sudden increase of body fatness that is occurring in, as you said, in affluent, the Western societies. And this has become a major issue, not just for adults, but also for children. So we definitely want to figure out what's going on here. And often the mainstream, I'm pretty sure that a lot of viewers and listeners know this, there's a variety of explanations for why this is happening. And it often comes down to demonizing either specific foods or specific macronutrients. One of the most famous attempts to explain obesity is the so-called carbohydrate insulin hypothesis that I'm sure you're familiar with in depth. And the most recent iteration of that point and of that hypothesis that this whole issue is caused by an excess amount of sugar intake or carbohydrate in general. So before we get into how the brain regulates body weight, let's first define what causes changes in body fatness, like on a basic level.
Yeah, on a very basic level, it is the calories you take in minus the calories leaving your body. It's basically simple arithmetic that if you take in more calories into your body than are leaving your body, then that's going to cause the accumulation of calories in your body. That's just arithmetic. And we know that adipose tissue or body fat is the primary energy storage site of the body. And so if the calorie content of your body is increasing, for the most part, that means that your body fatness is increasing. And so, and we know from many controlled feeding studies that when you change the amount of calories that a person is taking in, it really doesn't matter whether those calories are coming from carbohydrate or fat or sugar. You're going to get changes in body fatness that are determined by the change in calorie intake, not by where those calories are coming from. So, in fact, calories are the only food property that has ever been shown to impact body fatness. There is no other food property that has been shown in controlled feeding trials to impact body fatness. So independently of calories, I should say. So it's not that macronutrients or other properties of food cannot influence body fatness. They can, but they influence body fatness primarily by affecting how many calories you're taking in.
Yeah, that's important to point out because obviously there's no inherent fattening property of sugar or any other macronutrient absent of excess calories. Now, looking at body fat regulation itself, and I mean, there's a lot of confusion there. I mean, you can say it's calories in versus calories out, but it's a little bit more complex than that when you dig deeper into the whole equation. And looking at, let's say, certain overfeeding studies, as you mentioned there, we can see a lot of intra-individual variability. What could explain, for example, some of these changes that individuals are experiencing? Some gain a lot of weight, looking at, let's say, twin studies, and some don't gain as much, and also the distribution of where the fatness is stored, I mean, where the fat is stored is different. What could explain these factors?
Yeah, so a couple of points here. One of them, the one I want to start with is that just to give people some general context, in these overfeeding studies, what they do is they feed people an excess number of calories, so more calories than they need to maintain their weight, more than they would normally eat in their daily lives. And then they see what effects that has on body fatness. And what they observe is that some people readily gain fat when they eat excess calories. Other people, you feed them the exact same excess calories from the exact same food, and their bodies just basically burn off the excess calories, at least most of them. And those are the two extremes. And then there's everything in between. So some people, maybe will burn off 90% of the calories. Some people will burn off 50% of the calories. Some people will burn off none of them, and every excess calorie goes right into their fat tissue. So it's highly variable, and I think that one of the things that perhaps we'll get to later in the interview is that it depends very much on where you are relative to where your brain wants you to be in terms of body fatness. So your brain regulates around a certain body fat set point, kind of similar to how your thermostat would regulate around a particular temperature. And if you try to go above that set point by eating more, so if you're trying to pack on more fat than your brain kind of is used to, then in some people your brain is going to say, hey, I don't really want this. And in some people it's going to initiate a response that burns off those excess calories, but that response is highly variable. Conversely, in the downward direction, so if you're trying to lose weight and your brain says, hey, whoa, body fat's going away, pretty much almost everyone has a reaction in the opposite direction. So the brain tries to bring the fat back, and we can get back to that. But for now, I want to say the difference in susceptibility to fat gain during overfeeding probably has a lot to do with genetics. So, a genetics researcher named Claude Bouchard determined that if you take twins and you overfeed them, identical twins, you see very, very similar responses. So not only do they gain the same amount of fat, but they even gain it in the same places. Whereas if you look between twins, so like people, if you compare people who are not related, you see that they can gain very different amounts of fat and in very different places on their body. And so genetics is a major, major determinant of who is susceptible to fat gain and who is not. And we see these in the genetic studies. If you look at a wide variety of different types of studies, what you see is that the differences in body fatness between individuals in the general population, about 70% of those differences are explained by genetic differences between people.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and the reason why I want to point this out, I mean, certainly we can't do much about genetics at this point, at least in our what we currently have available as tools. And another very interesting factor here, I mean, our genetics haven't changed that at all. I mean, in the last couple hundred years, and we still have this issue of essentially something else has changed that has caused us to overeat and become obese. I mean, maybe not me and you, but let's say that the two, 1/3 of the population in the United States. I mean, we're dealing with obesity, and then we have 2/3 basically classified as overweight, which is an incredible amount compared to just 100 years ago. And obviously, genetics don't change in 100 years. So let's give a kind of a broad perspective of the impact of what are some of the shifts in the environment that happened in the last, let's say, 100 years that could explain this sudden increase in food consumption, and probably at the same time with a decrease in physical activity that is occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, I think that's a very important point that needs to be made when in discussions of the genetics of body fatness, and that is that these genetic findings apply to a particular cultural and environmental context. So it doesn't, when I say that 70% of the differences in body fatness are determined by genetics, that doesn't mean that environment is not important. What that means is that in modern affluent Western societies, almost everyone is in the same fattening environment. And so, because there's not a lot of environmental variability, variability in the genetics is what's going to determine primarily how fat people are. And so, it those findings do not at all mean that environment and how you live and how you eat are not important. In fact, it can have a very, very important impact, as you pointed out, by saying that 100 years ago there was a lot less obesity. But I think that one thing that we have to recognize is that, at least in the United States, body fatness has probably been increasing gradually over the last 100 or 120 years. And we do have this jump, this faster increase that occurred in the late 70s or early 80s, or began in the early 70s or early 80s. But our body fatness has been increasing for a long time in the United States at a slower rate. And I think what this corresponds with is, if I could really boil it down to two factors, what it really boils down to is increasing affluence and technological development. And what that has created is it's removed a lot of physical activity from our lives. So that's one of the things that's happened. It's removed a lot of physical activity from our lives. So in the United States, if you go back 100 years, most people were working manual labor jobs. They were working really hard. And even things like doing laundry, hanging up your laundry to dry, making food, walking instead of driving a car. People didn't have cars. I mean, life itself was a lot more physically demanding back then. And technology has erased physical activity from our lives. I mean, today, you don't have to get most people hardly have to get any physical activity. And if we want physical activity, we have to go out of our way for it. And that's not really how the human brain is designed to regulate physical activity. The brain is designed to try to minimize physical activity because that was, you know, you don't want to be wasting calories in a traditional human context. That's a really bad idea. You want as many calories as you can get because they're hard to come by. That's no longer true today, but our brains haven't updated. So that's one thing that's happened. But another thing that's happened that I think is probably even more significant is that our food system has changed quite dramatically. So, and I would say if I could encapsulate that in one concept, it's that we have outsourced our food preparation to professionals in the food industry. And I'm talking about um, the food industry as in corporations that make processed food, but I'm also talking about restaurants and grocery stores that sell prepared food that we can bring into our own homes. This food is very, very calorie dense. It contains all the things that the brain instinctively loves, like calorie density and fat, sugar, salt. It's marketed very, very persuasively. Excuse me. It's marketed very persuasively, and it's very easy. And I think that, and what I mean by that is it's very convenient. So, and I think that's very, very important because the amount of time and effort that we have to put into getting food is one of the big important factors that the brain takes into account when it's making food related decisions. So, for example, if a piece of food is within arm's reach, you're a lot more likely to eat it than even if you just have to get up and walk across the room to get it. So the brain responds very powerfully to effort barriers. And if you have very calorie dense tempting foods that are readily available, you will be more likely to eat those foods and more often and probably more of them. And as part of this increase in affluence and technological development, so the quality of our food has changed more towards calorie density and properties that the brain really craves. The convenience has increased and the cost has decreased by quite a bit. So, I think it's probably the same everywhere in the world. People love to complain about how much food costs, but I know that in the United States, if you go back to the 1940s, people were spending a quarter of their disposable income on food, 25%. And today we're only spending 10%. So the cost of food has declined dramatically relative to the amount of money that we have to spend, at least over the long haul. So basically, if you put all that together, what you end up with is that the things that the brain really loves about food, like uh, salt, sugar, fat, calorie density, flavors have gone up, convenience have gone up, and the things that the brain doesn't like about food, like it being expensive, inconvenient, have gone down. So it basically makes a situation where you're more likely to eat and you're more likely to eat more food.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good explanation there. And one of the part of the book that I really like the most is the simple equation. I mean, will you go into the nature to pick up a little bit of broccoli that would take you 500 calories to get? I mean, certainly that wouldn't be the most favorable thing for your survival. And one of those quotes I believe from the book was, "What life really is turning calories into kids." And that's essentially
Yeah.
what what survival is at the top priority for the brain. And the reproduction, of course, is there, and for that we need a lot of calories. Now, looking at it from more in depth on a kind of a brain level, what are, let's say, the two systems? I mean, we're looking at homeostatic and non-homeostatic systems of this regulation of how much we overconsume. What would you say are the factors for each of those systems that are now being influenced by this bombardment of not just availability, but let's say even marketing that is directly targeting consumers to basically get them to buy certain foods? I mean, at a very low cost, as we mentioned, their availability. What are some of the things that are overriding these systems that we naturally, I mean, should be able to resist, but we just simply can't because the offer is too good. We can't refuse it.
Yeah, so just to make sure everybody understands this concept of homeostatic versus non-homeostatic, um, homeostatic eating is eating due because your brain thinks you need energy. So if you're hungry, that would be homeostatic eating. Non-homeostatic eating is eating for other reasons, so pleasure, or because it's right in front of you, or because you're trying to win a hot dog eating contest or something like that. And a lot of the eating that we do that I think is really problematic is non-homeostatic. So if you only ever ate when you were really actually hungry and you stopped when you were not hungry anymore, if everybody did that, I think there would probably be less obesity. But I think alcohol is a great example, and coffee or tea as well. We don't drink alcohol because we're hungry for the calories in alcohol, but it's very, very caloric. We drink it because we want the pleasure value of the alcohol. And we do the same thing with coffee and tea. We want the stimulation and the pleasure and seductiveness of that, but we're consuming sugar and cream at the same time. So even though we don't need energy, we're giving our body energy anyway. And same for desserts. So if you have a full meal and then you eat a dessert after that, you're generally not hungry anymore. You really don't need to keep eating. You eat because you're very tempted. So I think targeting that non-homeostatic eating is a reasonable way to try to bring calorie intake in line with your true calorie needs. And there are different ways that the modern diet undermines both homeostatic and non-homeostatic eating to drive it higher and higher. But I can talk about just a couple of those. I think one of the primary drivers of non-homeostatic eating is food reward. So this is the um, motivational value and the pleasure value of food. You could call it the seductiveness of food. That's a concept that I like to use that I think makes it easy for people to understand. But basically, the brain has certain things it's looking for in food. The brain wants starch, it wants fat, it wants sugar, it wants protein, it wants salt. We're literally hardwired to want those things. And and those are things that the brain intuitively values. And when those things are present at high concentrations in a food, and particularly when they're and mixed together in certain very seductive combinations, like an ice cream or pastries or whatever cookies, whatever your favorite thing is, um, these are all things, the foods that really drive us, the foods that are the most seductive and that we overeat even when we're not hungry they tend to be foods that have those properties that I'm talking about that the brain is really looking for. Like people don't people don't crave raw broccoli and go into the fridge and eat raw broccoli because they really want raw broccoli, They crave potato chips and they crave ice cream and they crave these calorie dense things that the brain is hardwired to value. And so when we consume those things, those properties that the brain is hardwired to value, it starts spiking dopamine in the brain. And what dopamine does is it sets your motivational value, it sets your motivational drive. And so if you eat those foods and you get lots of dopamine spiking in your brain because your brain says, hey, I really would like this food, I like what's in it, then you're going to have a very high motivational drive in the future to obtain those foods. And that motivation can be so high that it drives you to eat those foods regardless of your hunger or your perceived or true energy needs. And so that explains why you might want to eat a dessert after a meal, why you might eat potato chips sitting on the counter, um, why you drink beer or drink wine, uh, and those sorts of things. So that's a major factor that drives you to increase your calorie intake unnecessarily. Then on the homeostatic side, there are things that can undermine how your brain actually perceives fullness and how it responds to a perceived energy need. And so there are a couple different ways this can happen, but the simplest is that there's a part of your brain called the brainstem that receives signals from your digestive tract as you eat. And so when you eat food, there are all these sensors in your mouth and in your small intestine and in your stomach that measure the volume of what you ate and they measure the chemical composition. So those are sending signals back to your brain that are saying, hey, this is how much fat, this is how much starch, this is how much sugar, this is how much protein, this is how much salt is in this food. That sends signals back to the brain. And in addition to determining dopamine response, it also goes into this part of the brain called the brainstem that integrates all those things. And the brainstem says, hey, I'm going to add up all this stuff that you ate, and I'm going to use that information to set your level of fullness that you feel, that you perceive. So when you feel full, that's not because your stomach is actually lacking room. It's not because your stomach doesn't have any room anymore. Typically, it's because your brainstem has generated a sensation, a signal to the rest of your brain that tells you to stop eating food. So that's what fullness actually is. And it turns out and by the way, this is a very important process. You know, I'm sure everyone knows this, understands this intuitively, but it's a very important process because fullness is an intuitive signal that tells us to stop eating. And so when you feel fullness in a meal is an important determinant of how big your meals are and how many calories you're taking in. And so it turns out that the amount of fullness you feel is only loosely connected to the number of calories that you're taking in. And so you can kind of game the system to eat fewer calories and experience the same level of fullness. And you can do that by eating food that is lower in calorie density, that is fewer calories per unit volume, so your stomach is fuller, even though there aren't as many calories in there. Eating higher protein food, higher fiber food, and food that's not highly palatable. So food that's not highly seductive tends to be more filling per unit calorie. And those things will all um, help the homeostatic side of the equation feel like your brain will say, hey, I'm not hungry anymore. I have enough energy, even though you've eaten less than you might with other types of foods.
Yeah, and we know this, for example, let's look at the fitness bodybuilding kind of world where you will see as natural bodybuilders, fitness models start preparing for competitions, the food volume will go up sky high, the calories will kind of remain the same. There's a lot of vegetables involved, a lot of fruits involved, a lot of very high volume foods, very low caloric density. We know that kind of works, as well as combining the protein, as you mentioned, can kind of quote unquote trick the system. In reality, it doesn't really feel that that's actually tricking the system. It's more that we're tricking the homeostatic system by eating ultra processed food, which it doesn't actually provide those cues that we're looking for. Now, speaking of the homeostatic system, I mean, ties well into the regulation of our set point, also called settling point, as people, different phrases, I guess, used in different contexts. But we know that the body kind of hovers around a specific level of body fatness where you're kind of comfortable. So let's say someone who is currently overweight, one interesting thing is that when they start losing body fat, let's say consciously trying to reduce calories and they keep reducing calories to maintain the rate of fat loss, what tends to happen is that there's a strong pull to come back to that previous level of body fat. To, let's say, the hunger goes up and we know that a lot of other kind of adaptations happen. I mean, in your opinion, how could we kind of game that system of regulation to kind of make that journey easier? Because obviously conscious effort works, but it's not going to work. It's not a very sustainable kind of approach if we're looking at just willpower itself. It's a very limited resource. I mean, it doesn't last for months or lifetime, essentially, what is necessary. How would you game the system, quote unquote?
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is something that is very, very important to understand about weight loss is that the body does not respond to changes in body fatness passively. It responds to them actively, just like your thermostat would want to regulate the temperature by engaging heat or air conditioning. The body fights changes in body fatness, especially in the downward direction, by engaging higher food motivation, higher food seductiveness, and by restricting calorie expenditure. So, and there's this whole suite of behavioral and physiological adaptations that the brain engages to try to bring back lost fat. And this is called the starvation response, or that's what I call it. And that sounds like a harsh way to describe it, but I mean it really is. That is exactly what it is. And if you begin to lose weight, you someone who's lost 10 pounds probably wouldn't describe themselves as starving. And they aren't really, but I mean it's the same. What you end up with is a milder form of the exact same brain response that you would get if you were actually in, true starvation. So it's that's just as a way of framing it and thinking about it. The body actually resists that weight loss. And what's the implication of this? I mean, you were getting at this. It's really, you can maintain your calorie intake lower, or you can maintain your calorie expenditure higher, and you can maintain that lower level of body fatness. I mean, there's no doubt that if you can maintain a lower calorie intake, you can maintain that lower level of body fatness. It doesn't have to come back. But the problem is that it's very, very difficult. You can't fight that forever. You're essentially fighting yourself. You're fighting your
Yeah.
brain's own impulses. And so the question is, how do you make it as comfortable as possible? I would say it's comfortable and as sustainable as possible. And there are a few ways to do that. And I don't want to I don't want to present this as me having the perfect solution or the magic switch that we can flip, that we can turn off this response. Um, there's a lot more research we need to do on this, and I don't think anyone has come up with solutions that completely eliminate this. But there are clues in the research literature of ways that we can likely dampen this response and make weight loss and maintenance more comfortable, more sustainable, and more permanent with less effort. And so there are a few things we can do. One of them is to limit food reward, or the seductiveness of food. It turns out that when you eat these highly seductive foods, your brain values those foods to such an extent that it starts to take steps to allow you to eat more of those, because these are foods that would have improved the survival of your ancestors. And so the brain instinctively thinks, this is really good, we got to get some more of this stuff. And so it not only increases your appetite, but it also appears to increase your actual body fat set point. And so if you're eating food that's simpler, unrefined, simple foods that are more similar to what our ancestors would have eaten, I'm talking about satisfying foods, foods that are good and healthy and that you can enjoy, but that just aren't extremely seductive, modern, processed, refined foods. So things like fresh fruits and meats and unsalted nuts and vegetables and whole grains and beans, foods like that are simple but satisfying and help the brain be comfortable at a lower body fat set point. Another one that seems to help is physical activity, regular physical activity. There's a lot of evidence from animal models and some evidence from humans that can help you, at least for most people, it can help you maintain a lower body fat set point and feel more comfortable with the lower calorie intake. Also, maintaining healthy sleep habits is another thing that can help maintain those circuits in the brain that regulate body fatness and appetite. And then finally, another factor that I think can be very, very useful is eating a higher protein intake. Protein has been shown in many human studies to accelerate weight loss and improve weight loss maintenance. And there's some confusion about this because not all studies have shown that. However, if you look at the studies that actually achieved a substantial increase in protein intake, what you see is that they do tend to consistently support that conclusion. So protein dampens the appetite response to weight loss. It dampens the decline in calorie expenditure that occurs with weight loss, and it dampens the decline in lean mass that often occurs with weight loss. So it protein on multiple levels opposes some of these negative changes that we're trying to avoid when a person loses body fat.
So in a nutshell, we're looking at a single ingredient, kind of unprocessed, whole, healthy diet for the majority of time in order to, let's say, lower the set point so your body wouldn't be fighting you. And I know that you've written on this on your blog in the past on very simple, bland diets, bland liquid diets. Could you shed a little bit of light on that research, which I find really, really fascinating as something to be explored a little bit more, as viewers and listeners know that I'm actually often recommending blander diets, not just for the fact that they're easier to stick with in the sense that you don't get that pull toward highly processed foods, but also you get as you continue losing weight, you feel like there's a less of a hunger issue. There's more satiety going on, and in general, you feel much better. Let's go back to that research study. That's what I find very fascinating on the liquid blend diet and blend diets in general.
Yeah, there are a couple different studies that I think are really interesting in this regard. One of them was conducted by this researcher, Michel Cabanach. I think he's a Canadian researcher. And what he did was he took a group of people and he put them on this bland liquid diet where they were eating nothing else besides this bland liquid diet. And he observed that on this diet, their calorie intake declined. And over the course of 3 weeks, I think it was, they lost about 7 pounds. And he was wondering, well, how much of this effect could be due to the blandness of this diet? And by the way, this was not a weight loss study, and he was not asking them to eat less. They just spontaneously ate less. They were eating to hunger, and they just weren't very hungry. They weren't very hungry. They were losing weight. And he said, well, how much of this could have to do with the blandness of the diet? And so what he did was he took a different group of people and he restricted their calorie intake by the same amount as the people who went on the bland diet, except this time he had them deliberately reduce their calorie intake of their normal everyday foods by just using portion control. And so these people lost the same amount of weight over the same period of time, 7 pounds over 3 weeks. And by design, that's how they designed the study. But the difference is that at the end of that 3 week period, the people who had restricted their food by portion control were extremely hungry. They were obsessing over food. They were dreaming about food. Whereas the people on the bland liquid diet, they had no problem. They weren't even hungry. They were eating as much as they wanted. And so that blandness of the food and the repetitiveness of the food seemed to very much dampen the appetite response and dampen that normal starvation response that would occur to weight loss. And then there was another study that was done that lasted even longer, but it was similar in the sense that they had people on these bland liquid diets. And this is almost as close as you can get to completely eliminating food reward altogether. These people were in a hospital setting, so in a metabolic ward setting where they couldn't eat any other food other than what the investigators provided. And they were given this bland liquid diet that they drank through a straw. And it was like hooked up to this machine, and every time they pressed a button, they would get a certain amount of the stuff through the straw. And these people were told, just eat as much as you want. It was not a weight loss study. They were just told, eat to fullness, eat however much you want. And interestingly, what they found is that lean people continued to eat their normal calorie intake. It didn't change at all. And they didn't gain or lose any weight. And by the way, this I want to just provide a little bit of background. This bland liquid diet that they were feeding them had quite a bit of sugar in it. So just keep that in mind as I describe these results. And then they started trying the same situation with people with obesity, people with a lot of excess fat mass. And what they found is that their calorie intake dropped down to staggeringly low levels, just like a few hundred calories per day. And they were eating to fullness. They said, I'm full, I'm not hungry. That's just all they wanted to eat. And that continued for weeks, and they lost weight at a very rapid rate, despite the fact that this diet was high in sugar. That's why I emphasize the sugar thing, because some people claim that, sugar is this thing that
The
fattens
devil.
us regardless of calories. And anyway, so one guy stayed on this diet for, I think, almost an entire year. I don't remember exactly how long it was, almost an entire year. And he lost like 200 pounds without having any hunger, without having any difficulty, and evidently without experiencing the starvation response. And so that shows that going to an extreme in terms of restricting the reward value of the diet or the seductiveness of the diet can have very profound impacts on appetite and body fatness. Um, and obviously, I think most people don't want to go on that kind of diet and maybe don't need to go on that kind of diet. But I think that we can get some of the same benefits just by eating simple, whole, unrefined foods that are more similar to what our distant ancestors would have eaten.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tool in a toolbox, depending on how much you respond to food reward. I'm pretty sure that there's a variability there as well, that certain individuals will be very prone to seek out to maximize caloric density and palatability, while others might respond less to those kind of cues, although we do kind of respond, all of us, to some extent. Now, interesting question I have for you, since we spoke about a liquid bland diet now, let's take it to the other extreme. If you had a chance to get 10 lean individuals that are kind of settled around 10-12% body fat, pretty lean, active males, and if you had them in a metabolic ward, they had no research. There's actually no, but you're in control. Like you're in control of everything. What would you do to make them fat as fast as possible? So if you had a chance to do that, what would you how would you design the situation there to get these guys to eat as much as possible, basically?
Yeah. So, yeah, we have pretty good evidence to answer this question because it's been done before by accident. So Eric Ravison in the 19, can't remember whether the first study was in the 80s or 90s. I think it was in the early 90s. He took some lean men and he put them in a metabolic ward and he put them, this was not it was not a study on weight loss or weight gain. There were no instructions given about how many calories to eat, but he put them in this metabolic ward with these big vending machines full of highly palatable processed foods. And they were all free. They didn't have to pay anything to eat these foods. It was very easy to get them. They were just in the next room. All they had to do was enter a code to identify themselves, and they would get whatever foods they wanted. And there were lots of highly palatable, calorie dense foods like breakfast sausages with maple syrup and sweetened cereal and sodas and all sorts of good stuff, pudding. And and over the course of the experiment, Ravison, Dr. Ravison noticed that these people were overeating tremendously. They were overeating by they were overeating 73% more calories than they needed to be eating to maintain their weight. And that was even though no one had asked them to overeat. They were just spontaneously overeating by this insane amount of calories and gaining fat at a rapid rate. And so I think that shows that having highly palatable, calorie dense foods that are easily accessible and cheap, which is what we have in our modern environment, is a very, very fattening scenario, and that people will overeat and gain fat even if they have no intention of doing so. So I think that experiment that he did is kind of an exaggerated version of the world that we live in every day. And I think the reasons why it makes people fat are similar. And I want to mention real quick that this same environment of providing a large variety of highly palatable, calorie dense foods, it's the same thing that fattens any animal. I mean, I shouldn't say any animal because I don't know that for a fact for every animal, but many animals. I mean, like rodents. The fastest and most effective way of making a rat or mouse obese is to put a variety of highly palatable human foods into their cage and just let them eat as much as they want. And they will become so fat so fast on these palatable human foods. I mean, that to me is just a very basic, simple, empirical observation that says we need to be really cautious around these foods and in this food environment if we want to maintain our calorie intake and our body fatness in the right range.
Yeah, that's that just a question that I had for you. So I know that it's probably going to be interesting for the listeners as well. I mean, the variety is just overwhelming. Our brains have that so-called buffet effect. You simply cannot ignore the variety presented to you. So many cues hitting us. Now, moving on, I just want to briefly touch on two important factors that I think are often underestimated in this whole equation of calories in, calories out, and in general, when we're talking about food consumption. And that's an impact of sleep and overall how our sleep has been reducing in the last couple of decades, and in both in quality and quantity. When we're talking about just the environment with electronics and all of that that we're dealing with today, um, what would you say, I mean, as a practical tip? I mean, is that something that you would aim at as well? I mean, we talk all about this, all about food, we talk about exercise, about protein, but how much is sleep a big factor here? Because we know that people are chronically underslept, and how much does that impact, how does that impact the brain?
Yeah. So I think food and the food environment is probably the number one factor, and I'm not sure exactly where sleep fits on the spectrum of importance of all these different factors, but I do think it is important. I do think it's one of the things that determines appetite and body fatness. And what you see, people have done experiments where under lab conditions, you get people to sleep a lot or you get them to sleep a little bit, and then you see how many calories they eat, and they eat more calories when they don't sleep enough. This has been clearly and repeatedly demonstrated. And in fact, you can look at what's going on in the brain when people haven't slept enough, and what you see is that they begin to respond more to food cues than they do when they've slept enough, and especially these calorie dense, highly palatable food cues. So this is actually the same response that you see in a person's brain when they're trying to lose weight and their brain is saying, "Hey, I want to get more calories here. I feel like we're starving." So the brain essentially is initiating this very similar response when you don't eat enough. So basically, not sleeping enough appears to trick the brain into thinking that you need more calories even when you really don't. So that's one interesting thing about it. But another thing is that it actually affects your decision making processes on a more cognitive level. And what it does is when you don't sleep enough, it has really bad impacts on a lot of different things in your brain. But one of those things is that it gives you what's called an optimism bias. And what that means is that you start to pay more attention to the potential benefits of a decision than you pay to the potential downsides or drawbacks of that decision. So for example, there are these studies where they restrict people's sleep and then they have them do gambling tasks, and they find that people are more willing to take risks, even irrational risks, when they have not slept enough because they care more about those winnings than they care about losing. And so the way that applies to food is that anytime you're thinking about eating a food, there are costs and benefits to that. So the costs would be, well, the benefit is often the pleasure value of that food. You're hungry and you think that food looks really good, and so that food is going to satisfy you. But the downsides have more to do with things like the long-term consequences. What effect is eating this food going to have on my health? What effect is eating this food going to have on my weight? And so often when we have these highly palatable, calorie dense, unhealthy foods, you're kind of making a decision based on the cost benefit of, are the long-term costs worth the pleasure that I'm going to get right now? And when you haven't slept enough, you have that optimism bias. It makes you think more about the pleasure side of it and less about the long-term costs. So you're more likely to make decisions that are not in line with your own best interests and are not possibly not in line with the decisions that you would make if you had more sleep.
So you're going basically for instant gratification. You're going for that immediate reward, more likely at least to go for that. And for the viewers and listeners, just to point out, I mean, since most of you guys watching this, you're probably interested in improving your body composition. We know that uh, chronic sleep deprivation, or even a couple of, let's say, weeks of sleep deprivation, has a huge impact when you're in a caloric deficit. We're talking about how much lean body mass you're losing, how much fat mass you're losing. I mean, we're talking about a huge difference here. At least in one study that I saw, I think 5.5 hours were compared with 8.5 hours, where the group that slept more basically managed to lose most of the weight was coming from fat, while the sleep deprived group was really severe. It's crippling basically your efforts to maximize fat loss. And now, I mean, we covered a lot of ground here. We talked about a lot of concepts. We've thrown out a lot of stuff, and of course, I'm going to leave the rest of for the viewers and listeners to check out in the book, which I highly, highly recommend. And of course, I'm going to link it in the description below so everybody can grab a copy. And for you guys, I mean, it's becoming my go-to gift for people who are, who are looking for new stuff to read. Now, I want to go just simply back to a couple of practical tips and evidence-based recommendations to, let's say, someone who wants to improve satiety and who might have issues with, let's say, how do you change that food environment? What do you do in your own little world when you have, let's say, your home, you have your workplace, you have these situations? What are some of the practicalities that we could apply just from based on your research that we can just start getting results from that to get the environment on our side?
Yeah, I think controlling your food environment is very, very critical because the brain is highly reactive to the cues in your surroundings. Those are the things that are going to drive your motivation, and those are the things that are going to nudge your behavior in one direction or the other. And so, if you can control your food environment and set it up so that the things that you want yourself to be doing are easy and the things that you don't want yourself to be doing are difficult, you're going to require a lot less willpower to have healthy, positive, constructive behaviors over the long run. And so, what you want to do basically is you want to control uh, you want to control the food cues that you're exposing yourself to in your home and at work. So, for example, don't have any food visible and especially within arm's reach that you don't want to be eating. So, at mealtime is fine, but if you walk into your kitchen, you shouldn't be seeing chips, you shouldn't be seeing soda, you shouldn't be seeing any of these tempting calorie dense foods. And second, provide yourself with effort barriers to consumption. So, for example, having to peel an orange or having to shell nuts, those very small effort barriers are enough to alter the cost benefit balance in your brain in terms of driving your eating behavior. So, if you have to work a little bit, you're probably not going to eat food unless you really want that food, unless you're genuinely hungry. And that will help to match your calorie intake to your true calorie needs. And then third, control the seductiveness of the food in your environment. So make sure that the food that's around is not food that you have a really hard time resisting. And for those foods, don't even have them in your house and don't even have them at work if that's possible for you, because even the knowledge that ice cream is in your freezer or that pizza is in your refrigerator or that pastries are in your cabinet, even that knowledge, even if you're not seeing it, even that knowledge is enough to affect your behavior and your cravings. So if those things are not an option in your home, not only will it be more difficult for you to eat them, but you will actually want them less because your brain drives cravings and it drives motivation based on what it thinks is possible. And so if your brain knows that there's something it really wants around, it's going to trigger your motivation. If it's not even an option, it probably will not trigger your motivation and your cravings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, since you mentioned the word cravings, I mean, it's an often a question of how do you, let's say, stop craving for something, and based on, let's say, your current knowledge and of the literature and what we know, Is there, let's say, a time period after a certain abstinence of consuming a certain food? Is there something that could indicate that we're craving less of that food? And we know that, let's say, the most famous one, chocolate, most likely is for a lot of people. For myself, I know that's an issue. So, is there, let's say, a time period after, let's say, if I don't eat chocolate, there's an improvement for my craving? Uh, when we're talking about chocolate, ice cream, or pizza, or other stuff.
Yeah, I can't give you a specific number. I don't know exactly how long it takes, but I do know that the cravings do dampen over time. Essentially, the brain forgets those reward associations slowly over time. It forgets those, um, it forgets that link between the cues, such as the sight or the smell of food, and the motivation that it triggers to get you to eat that food.
Mm.
So, and this is something that you see in people who are trying to quit cigarette smoking, for example. At first, it's very, very difficult, and all of the cues that surround cigarettes, like having a pack on the table, or being with a friend you normally smoke with, or seeing someone smoke, or walking into a convenience store that sells cigarettes, those cues are very, very powerful drivers of cravings and motivation. But the longer you abstain from smoking cigarettes, the less powerful those become. And typically, after a couple years, most people won't even crave cigarettes anymore. They could be around someone who's smoking and they wouldn't want one. It just kind of doesn't even seem appealing. So I think the same principle applies to food. I don't know exactly what the timeline is that it requires to get over that craving, but it does over time have and less of an impact on your motivation and on your behavior.
So we could kind of tame our brains. Let's say if we get that neuron firing, we don't want it to wire with the reward, which is eating that food. We could kind of unwire it if we get a different thing in place. Would you say that we could potentially even replace that reward with something else? Let's say if I get a craving for, I don't know, pizza, right? I could go take a walk. Would that be, or something else? Like I can reward myself in a different way. Maybe watch something else and on busy myself with something just to unwire that connection that we're dealing with here instead of reinforcing it, which makes it stronger and stronger. Is that what we're kind of?
Yeah. Yeah, you can do that to an extent. I mean, honestly, there's a fundamental difficulty here, and that's that food is a very, very powerful reward for the brain, and there just really aren't a lot of other rewards that are equally powerful that you can replace it with. So, I mean, going for a walk or taking a bath or calling a friend or having sex. I mean, sex is really, I would say that's probably one of the few other things that's powerful enough to compete with food in terms of our brain's reward pathways. But yeah, I mean, because I mean, you don't necessarily have to completely eliminate the craving, but even if you can do something that just makes it a little less powerful or distract yourself for a little while, it can often pass. I mean, these things are often very fleeting. And if you can kind of restrain yourself just for a little while, often you might not even want it after that. So yeah, I think going for a walk, going for a run, taking a bath, things like that, alternative sources of reward and pleasure can definitely be part of the equation. But I think you can't really expect I don't think you can expect going for a walk to satisfy yourself quite the same way as stuffing your face with pizza and ice cream.
True.
I think realistically, but it could be part of the strategy.
Maybe just wait and see if it's a true craving or if it's true hunger or whatever. It means that these are some of the strategies that might be useful to try out for yourself. And yeah, I want to. I mean, first off, thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. Thank you for the value bomb that you just dropped on everybody here in terms of the pure depth of the information, everything that will potentially guide the listeners to even research more. Check out your book that I would highly, highly recommend. And yeah, it's just a final question. I mean, in your work right now, where are you looking to branch? What are you working on right now in your research? And to give a little bit of a context, just as your personal goals.
Yeah, sure. So, uh, I don't have any immediate plans to write another book. I wrote this book because I had an idea that inspired me, and unless I have another idea that I really want to write a book about, I won't do it. Primarily right now, I'm doing science consulting and working for an organization called Open Philanthropy Project in San Francisco that's really doing some really good things. And I plan to continue with my writing on my website, stephanguyenet.com, just trying to communicate science to the public. This is the same thing I've been doing for years through my writing and speaking, and it's something that I think is very much needed in this day where there's so much misinformation out there. And so, yeah, I plan to do more writing and speaking and science communication in general.
Absolutely right on the point of misinformation, that it's really necessary to put stuff in the right context, and that's why I appreciate your work so much. It is just simple enough for the general public to understand, but at the same time, it is very, very powerful, and it actually is evidence-based, which is the most important factor. I mean, looking at the science of things. So thank you again for coming here. All of your social media and the websites for you guys watching this will be linked in the description below. So you can follow Stephan. I recommend following him on Twitter. I recommend following stephanguyenet.com and checking out the blog post there. There's a ton of stuff written, I remember, on your blog. Whole health source in the past. There was a lot of stuff. There's still a lot of stuff. I mean, you're coming out with articles regularly. The book is going to be the first link in the description below for you guys to check it out. Highly, highly recommend it. You can grab it off Amazon, everywhere else, right? It's like available in all kinds of places. And yeah, that is everything for today. I want to thank you guys for listening. If you have any questions or anything like that, make sure to leave that in the comments below. Thank you as well for being with us here for this quite a bit of a long interview, and have a great day. Peace.